Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to one of the main highlights of our events today, Going Beyond Quota, Empowering Women in the Transport Sectors. This session will tackle on the necessity of women empowerment in transport sectors and how will this bring us towards sustainable transport for all. Okay. In this panel discussion, we will bring you together with experts and practitioners to discuss if these policies are truly beneficial, and if they are, how they can be successfully implemented without losing sight of the goal for equalities. Please join me and welcome our session moderators, Dr. Sheila Napalang. Enjoy the show.
Good evening. Good evening from the Philippines. Good day to everybody, whatever would be your time zone. And welcome to their session, Going Beyond Quotas, Empowering Women in the Transport Sector. My name is Sheila Napalang. I'm currently the Assistant Secretary of the Department of Transportation of the Philippines and a member of the Women in Transport Leadership, as well as Women on the Move Network. And I will be your moderator this evening. In this 50-minute session, we will be having presentations and a panel discussion centered around the topic of women empowerment in transport. In particular, we will discuss how we can ensure that distinction or quotas for diversity meant to create safe spaces for women or empower their participation in the sector are only initial steps that lead to equality in transport, considering different spheres of possible involvement. As a user, as a worker, as a planner, as a policymaker, and even the user will have different perspectives as well. Now, our speakers for today would include a good friend of mine, a dear colleague, and I've worked with her for the longest time, Dr.Derlie Mateo-Babiano from the University of Melbourne. We will also be joined by Mr. Nguyen van Quyen, I hope I pronounced that well, from Vietnam's Automobile Transport Association. Good evening. All right. And Ms. Net Pham Thi Hong from GIZ, Vietnam. Good evening. Our session is being live streamed as part of the Transport Week Asia Conference Day and will be recording for posting later on online. This session is organized by several networks led by the Women on the Move Network, and together with the Women in Transport Leadership, Women Mobilize Women, and Women in Green Hydrogen, with the support, of course, from the GIZ Vietnam. You can learn more about these networks by scanning the QR code. Where's the QR code? On the screen. But do we have the QR code? I can't see it. But
we'll send a URL na lang po sa chat.
Or the link that will be sent through the chat. Oh, there you go. There's already the link. All right. And I'm actually equally grateful that it's not an all-women panel. We always say that we also need our male counterparts in our initiatives to make transport more accessible for women. So to start a conversation, we would like, I've already introduced them, but let me introduce them. Okay, so Derlie, a more expansive, so Dr. Babiano is an associate professor in urban planning and assistant dean of the of the Diversity and Inclusion of Melbourne School of Design in the University of Melbourne, and convener, which is actually the brains behind the Women in Transport Leadership. We will also be joined by Ms. Net Pham Thi Hong, a gender specialist from GIZ Vietnam, and Mr. Nguyen, I can't see them on the screen anymore, Nguyen Van, chairman of Vietnam Automobile Transport Association and former lead for gender with the Directorate for Roads. Welcome, Dr. Derlie, Ms. Net, and Mr. Nguyen. All right. So, can we start with the presentation now? Just a general question to just jumpstart just to jumpstart that discussion. Okay, in your sphere, in the work that you do, how can diversity and inclusion policies be implemented in a seamless and sustainable manner? Oh, Derlie, because you're highlighted, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Napala. So thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And it's nice to be with you again, meeting you again and having this discussion with you and with the rest of the panel. So so that question about how can we implement in a seamless and sustainable manner our diversity and inclusion policies. And I think it's important to understand what's diversity and inclusion within your context, right? So it's really important because sometimes how we define it would then lead to the policies that we would put in place. And then to what extent it will be adopted in a most efficient and effective way depends on how it's responsive to the issues and concerns of that context. So having said that, I think from my perspective, for instance, in the transport arena and using gender as a lens, I think when we talk about, in general, when we talk about diversity, it's really about representation. While when we talk about inclusion, it's about participation. So how can we ensure there's diverse representation in the transport sector, both as a user, as an operator, as a transport leader, as a policymaker, as a planner, right? And also looking at inclusion, which is how do we then ensure that we have an environment that would enable participation, that would allow you to engage. So I guess if we come up with policies that would respond to those two, and it's co-produced, I think that's an important aspect of it. So it's co-produced with the stakeholders that we are trying to engage with, then there will be ownership and buy-in. And if we have ownership and buy-in, then there is a highly likelihood that it will be seamlessly implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Derlie. It's good that you started with a definition of diversity and inclusion. And I like that you said like nothing about us without the inclusion of the stakeholders. Ms. Net, may I have your thoughts on how we can actually implement diversity and inclusion policy in a seamless and sustainable manner?
Yeah, thank you very much. For my side, I think it is very important to get the commitment and also support of the leaders here, maybe the policy maker or in the organization like the management board, because it can translate it in the budget allocation for the implementation of the strategy, and also assign the staff to implement the strategy. And the second point I would like to emphasize is within the organization or in the ministry, like the transport ministry, it is very important to have the gender focal point. This person can be facilitated to and coordinate to implement the strategy, because in some way we still need some focal point and then coordinate with different ministry or with different department within the organization to implement the strategy. So I want to add the 2 points for this question. Thank you.
That's actually a perfect complement to what they had mentioned earlier, because she said, that inclusion of the stakeholders, and Ms. Net was saying it's also important to get the commitment of the policymakers as well as have a gender focal point. Now, Mr. Nguyen, how do I say it, Nguyen? May I have your thoughts on how diversity and inclusion policies can be implemented in a seamless and sustainable manner.
Vâng, xin kính chào quý vị. Tôi đến từ Hiệp hội Vận tải ô tô Việt Nam.
Thank you very much. I'm from Vietnam Association for the Freight Transport. And I think for the government agencies, that means for the policymakers. So when they develop the certain policies covering the gender equality, that means the policies, the diversity and the inclusive policies, they really need to base on the research finding, on the cultural identity and the traditional customs, and also the characteristics and the features of the certain sectors and domains, so that we can come up with the sound policies. In Vietnam, when it comes to gender equality, gender equality have already very well covered by the legal framework. And in reality, in government agencies and also in the business settings, we have the kind of the trade union. One of the function and mandate of the trade union is to protect the legitimate rights and benefits of the employees. And when it comes to gender equality and the human rights protection and exercise in the business setting, this is the kind of the routine activities and mandates for the trade union. And the higher level of the trade union normally come to the business to have the monitoring and supervision of how the gender equality have been exercised in the business setting. So the gender equality have been very well implemented in Vietnam, with a very good effectiveness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nguyen, for because there's another side of gender equality, looking at it from the business side and making sure the policies that would be implemented are based on data and evidence, as well as the fullness of trade unions. Okay, I'm just going to go around and ask individually. Let me start with Dr. Derlie. Dr. Derlie, in the Women in Transport Leadership, one of your goals is to correct the gender imbalance in transport and landing. According to an article in the Melbourne School of Design, you said that sidelining distinct travel needs and requirements create social and economic disadvantages for the community. Could you please elaborate more on these social and economic disadvantages, and maybe also explain to those who may not be fully aware of these issues? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question, Dr. Napalang. And I think it's coming from the lens of what's transport for. So it's a derived demand, and some people would use transport for the sake of transport, but in general, we use it to either access opportunity or to support our mobility needs. And if the transport, because it does not consider the needs, the different needs or the diverse needs of women as compared to their male counterpart, then there would be that high likelihood that those needs are not responded to. So what I mean is that, for instance, women's mobility or travel pattern is quite different from their male counterpart. So for instance, we tend to have a more geometric movement, while on the other hand, male, because of that traditional, so we are of course considering the travel pattern from a traditional perspective, wherein male would be captured as traveling from their home to workplace, and it's very much linear. And because for example, our public transport, if we design it based on that linear work home travel pattern, then we obviously disadvantage women, and so women have to transfer several times because they have to bring their kids to school, or sometimes they need to go to the grocery before actually going home. So those kinds of trips happen before they actually arrive at their workplace, or before they go home, right? So in that sense, because we are disadvantaging women because of how transport system is designed, then the opportunities that they could have because of a better transport system is not there, right? So that's why I guess that's where the indirect economic cost of not providing for or considering the needs of women leads to.
Thank you, Dr. Derlie. That's a very, I like the visual that you showed, like, linear and geometric. It actually shows you the travel pattern, and it automatically, gives you a view of how men and women actually travel. And really good point, right? Another question I have for you is, you have done several research on different topics such as bike sharing, public bike sharing programs, bus rapid transit, pedestrians, and the like. From your research, were you able to see how differently women were affected by these? And what perspectives did you see? New perspectives did you see during your research?
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand what's the motivation and why I did those research. And I think because I now live in Australia, but I do a lot of research in the Philippines and other countries as well. Since I've moved to Australia about more than a decade ago. And then at that time, bike sharing was introduced. And what was interesting for me was understanding. So I'm an active traveler, so I commute by bicycle as well. And what was interesting for me when I was in Brisbane was that not a lot of women were cycling. And then when bike sharing was introduced, I think about 40% of women said that they intended to use bike sharing. So, but I think after 2 years, we were able to engage with the Brisbane City Council and have data sharing agreement. And so we were able to disaggregate the data on the actual use of from a gender perspective, so gender disaggregated data. And it turned out that only 28% of women actually used bike sharing. And so I wondered what was the difference between what made them, had the intent to actually use bike sharing, but then in actuality, they didn't use bike sharing. And so I really wanted to understand that phenomenon. And also from earlier literature, a lot of information already, particularly in developed country context. I actually don't want to use that word, but like for example, in the U.S., in Canada, in Australia, so there was really a very minimal number of. So I think 1 of 5 women cycle. So 1 woman and 4 man cycle, right? So I was just wondering what were the barriers and facilitators, and what would facilitate, and that's why I did the survey. And I guess some of the insights that came out of it was, for instance, that I guess again the travel pattern. So how do women bike share? And what was interesting from the results of our research was understanding that loop trips would usually be done by women, and it's usually with someone else, and it's usually on the weekend. Well, it was all obviously within that context of bike sharing, Brisbane's bike share, right? So city cycle scheme. And while on the other hand, there were stations that I've kind of coined as male stations and female stations. And I tried to understand the land use around the area. And so what I found out was that women would typically use bike share stations that were in residential areas, while men would be using bike share stations in highly dense and busy, roads, 60 kilometers per hour road, but women would not dare go to, use those stations. So that was quite an interesting phenomenon. And obviously, as we know, women would typically not cycle going up the hill. And so a lot of both built and natural, I guess, environment variables were either facilitating or were barriers to women's uptake of bike share?
Thank you, Dr. Derlie. I was smiling when she said that women usually don't like to use roads that are, that would be high speed, but only a few brave souls like Dr. Derlie would actually bike along Vietnam's busy road. She made us bike there. Anyway, thank you for actually also showing us that land use is very important when you talk about stations. And again, the loop thing, the geometry is also there. All right, thanks, Dr. Derlie. We'll come back to you if you have time later for the questions. Mr. Nguyen, sir, you were able to speak to customs news last year, and you mentioned some of the difficulties the transport enterprises are facing since the fourth wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as suggestions to support transport businesses that are facing a lot of difficulties. Can you share with us the difficulties these businesses are facing, and if there is anything you're planning to do as far as women in the industry are concerned?
Đối với cái
Thanks for your question.
đối với cái hoạt động vận tải
You know that for the for the passengers transport,
giai đoạn là
for
dịch Covid-19
the period of when we are suffering from COVID-19 pandemic,
thì phải nói là cái hoạt động vận tải
we should say that the passengers transport have been very much affected.
các cái doanh nghiệp ấy thì
For businesses,
đến 80%
then when you look at those, about 80% of those have to stop their operation for the very long period of time.
về phía hiệp hội chúng tôi đấy,
From our association,
đã tập hợp
we
những cái tình hình
uh,
có những cái báo cáo đề xuất
we have already have some of the recommendations and suggestions to the regulators to see how can they proceed with the support for the operators and for our businesses.
ví dụ như là những cái giải pháp chúng
For
tôi
example,
là tăng cường cái
we ask for
áp dụng chuyển đổi số
the ask for the digitalization, digital transformation, where we can connect the passengers and the operators so that we can reduce the contacts and the exposures to the viruses. And we also try to ask the regulators not to ask the operators to stop for the COVID test during the itinerary. Because you know that the government agencies sometimes they have the policies asking the drivers to do the COVID test at the bus stops or at the rest area. So this is really very difficult. So and then you know that when we talk about the urban mobility, you know that in Vietnam the proportion of the private cars and two-wheelers really very common. So how can we encourage women to use buses? The operators have in place some of the measures. They have some camera, that means the CCTV in the vehicle for the safety monitoring in the bus, and they also have kind of the very good communication and for you know that assigning the priority seats for elderly people, for pregnant women. We also work with some businesses on the topic of the digital transformation, so that for the 7-seated or 9-seated to involve in the car sharing for the short distance in the urban area. We are intent to ask for the permission from the regulators to do the pilot of the car sharing for the 7- and 9-seated cars in Hanoi. We very much hope that the government agencies and the regulators will do some kind of the studies and allow us to do the pilot of the car sharing. that we can use the 7 or 9-seated cars for this short distance of from 2 to 5 kilometers, so that we can pick up students or women to the supermarket or grocery market, or for elderly people to go to the green parks. And we can use the elderly cars to serve the mobility needs in the urban area.
Interesting, Nguyen. It's interesting how digitalization has actually helped in making transport more efficient, particularly during COVID-19. And we also take note that we have CCTV buses to make women feel safer. And we hope for your sharing. I have another question for you. According to Hanoi Times, you have been helping the transport sector get back up on its feet due to the impact the pandemic. How was this process? And did you notice any difference in how the women were affected, particularly? All right, let's go back to Mr. Nguyen. I think he got logged out. So here we go.
Vâng, trong cái dịch
during COVID-19 pandemic. So the mobility by women or men, of course, they were equally affected during COVID-19 for their mobility. And during COVID period, the operations of buses were almost halted or suspended, and there was a limited operation of taxis. And when pandemic control measures were loosened, and we apply measures like passengers need to wear face masks, and they have to declare health through scanning QR code. And transport operators are required to do the cleaning of their vehicles and provide extra face masks in case passengers did not have their own face mask, and then they are provided by drivers, and they are required to do disinfection of the vehicles, and then also passengers are required to do sanitation. That's why the cost for transport operation increased significantly. But of course, transport operators understand the responsibility to the community. That's why they were willing to incur the costs in order to meet the requirement of disease control regulation by the government and for the sake of the community health.
Heartwarming to actually hear that the operators are actually willing to take on that increase. And I think it's the same across the different countries. When the pandemic hit us, public transport was actually the first one to be suspended, and we all had to go to contact tracing. But the importance of actually, it's like community work, right? Because the operators are willing, we're willing to actually also help. So thank you, Mr. Nguyen. Let me now then move to Ms. Nat. I like your this. I think the question is very interesting for Ms. Nat, and it's very cultural, right? Since you live in Vietnam, and as stated in the GIZ Vietnam website, I will read, quote, "The Vietnamese culture is influenced by Confucianism interpretation, characterized by male privilege and hierarchical relationships, resulting in gender stereotype and inequality." Now, being a gender specialist working in Vietnam, what are the biggest challenges of your job considering this context?
In Vietnam, I think you already read the analysis, and we highlight that the gender stereotype is the biggest barrier for the women to participate in the social, economic, and also public life. And we can take the transport sector as an example. That's you can see that in the transport sector, it is dominated by men, and very few women working in this sector. And to my, I got this recent report that's now in transport sector, just only 24% working, 24% of women working in transport sector, and a very low percentage of the women in leadership in transport sector. And it comes back to the gender stereotype. We can see that because with the gender stereotype in Vietnam, women are often perceived to have a less leadership capacity. Like men, are presumed to be a good leader with the animated ability, and women are often stereotyped that they should be the to be the family carer of the family. So it also affected the women the opportunity to participate in the the social and also public life. And also there is another kind of the stereotype that we can see that in many survey to measure the support from the public for the women's leadership, and we can see that people often perceive that women should be familiar with some kind of the job with need the patient and also skillful, while men should be familiar can do better in the some kind related to the technical skill. So it also limited, it influenced the perception of the people, and also influence the women. It is also one example to influence that the women are underrepresented in the transport sector. So for me, for the gender stereotype is the biggest and also barrier, and also the root cause for the women's leadership and women's participation in the different activities.
Thank you, Ms. Nat. So the biggest barrier is really the stereotyping, right? And so we need more support. Did you notice any difference in the way women are treated in your country compared to those in other countries?
Can you repeat the question, because I cannot hear it?
Did you notice, because that the greatest barrier well, the greatest challenge is the stereotype itself, right? That women are supposed to be just home caregivers at home, and men are supposed to be leaders, right? Did you notice any difference in the work that you do? Did you notice any difference in how women are treated in Vietnam compared to those in other countries?
I think the gender stereotype is not only issue in Vietnam, but also in other countries also. Because if you look at the transport sector, not only in Vietnam, but also in other countries, we can see that's very low representation of the women in leadership in the transport sector. And even if we look at the share of the female employees in the transport sector, not only in Vietnam, and I also see from other countries, is very low. And with my understanding that the gender stereotype is a big barrier for the women. And I can see that, for example, in India, is not only the gender stereotype, but also other social factor also influence the women to participate in some kind of the technical area, like the transport or energy sector.
Thank you. It is true, right? That it can be, it's just a problem, not just in Vietnam, but in other countries as well. It depends on the social structure as well. Now, thank you, ladies. I know this could still be expanded a bit more, but our chat box has been burning with a lot of questions. So let me then just ask the questions as I've seen in the chat box. Okay, let me see. All right. Okay. Hang on. I'm actually going through it so I can read everything. Okay. All right. From the audience, some, and anybody can answer this. Right?
Yeah.
Some demands from advocacy groups are on gender segregated transport. These do not work from the operations perspective, especially in case of buses in valley transit, meaning these would only be for women, only buses for women. Now, in your opinion, how does involving civil society organizations also include building their capacity on how in moving towards understanding public transport operators? Let's simplify the question. The question is, a lot of groups are saying, oh, let's do gender segregated transport, but that's not operationally viable. How then can we include the civil society organizations? So this conversation on segregated would actually be more understood. Anybody can answer?
I can
Yes,
answer.
Dr. Derlie, go ahead. Yes.
So I think different stakeholders, different groups would have different roles. And I think the role that an NGO could play is actually education at the grassroots. So I think it's important to understand why, when and why segregation will work and not work. Because I think at the short term and immediate term, for instance, it works because it will allow the segregation and limit, for instance, harassment could be chronically happening in a locality. On the other hand, it does not address the core issue, the root cause of sexual harassment, for instance, or violence in transport. And so there is a need for a longer term education, and why we need to, I guess, focus on respect. That we need to ensure that we move respectfully. We need to ensure that we respect our neighbor, we respect the other person as they respect us, and if that's the framework that we will be using when we design and plan for transport, then it's easy to justify why we can't do violence. For example, we can't be harassing people. On the other hand, because education and how education is learned and normalized as a transforms behavior, it takes time. And so because it takes time, you have to have band-aid solutions at the start to kind of address the problem. And it goes with bystander training, ensuring that reporting is in place, which does not question the harassed, but actually understand and believe them. So there are several things that should happen. And I think having a suite of solution is necessary. And NGOs, because they are directly engaged with communities, have a huge and significant role to play in terms of education. And at the same time, also, because they are the ones who are using public transport, and they have, I guess, they're the first responder if they are, if a sexual violence happens in transport. But at the same time, they are also, the majority of them are using public transport, and they have that lived experience. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Derlie. So it's really about context in talking about segregated, as well as involvement of those who actually use it. Ms. Ness, Nguyen, can you add some more on how you can actually put this conversation on the table? Ms. Ness, go ahead.
Thank you very much. You already mentioned the role of the NGO, but another stakeholder I think is very important is the media. With our recently in Vietnam, we also have an analysis on the role of the media, and media play very important role to shape the social discourse on the gender equality. For example, when we do the analysis in the media, we can see that the media, for example, the mainstream media, the women's leadership is the frequency and also of the women's leadership in the media article is very low, and also there is also the gender stereotype on the women's leadership and also the gender stereotype in general existing in the media. So I think the media play very important role. With the recent experience from some public campaign, we can see that the media, for example, can do some kind of the public profiling of the active women in the transport sector, so it can change the mindset of the people that the women can be contribute. Can make the progressive contribution to the transport sector for something like this. So and also we can do some kind of the public campaign in the social media to change the perception of the people on the women's role and also their perception about the gender equality. But I think the key message that's for the media or NGO need to deliver is we need to focus on the human rights. Gender equality is the human rights, and both women and men and people from the different group can have their right to access to the high quality transport and also the safe transport. So I think it is a key message, and with the media and NGO can do the different way to raise awareness for the people.
Thank you very much. That's a good point, right? Having the media be included, because the media is a power force. Mr. Nguyen, would you like to add to this conversation? The conversation on having segregated buses and transport. What do you think? Can that be done from the business perspective? Because I know you work with businesses. Do you think that can be done?
Vâng, tôi thì tôi cho rằng là cái
I think that the proportion of employees, females employees in the transport sector in Vietnam accounts for more or less 20%. So this low proportion does not come from the stereotype, but this low proportion comes from the characteristic of the transport sector, because the transport sector employees have to work in a very mobile environment, and it's a heavy job and pretty hazardous job. And for women, besides the work, and they are presumed to have a family responsibilities. That's why the number of female employees seeking jobs in the transport sector is lower than that of female employees. It is due to the characteristics of the work, and it is not the stereotype of the employers, or it is not the issues of our policies. So recently we conducted a survey, and which shows that women in the transport sector, they did the work, for example, having contact with passengers, and they also engage in business management, and then in digital transformation. and women are more working in this area in management of transport and digital transformation, especially during the period of COVID when e-commerce boomed and transport operators or passenger service operators, they also women were engaged more and they were engaged effectively in e-commerce. And so I think that if we improve, if we renovate, and if we promote digitalization in the transport sector, it will provide more employment opportunities for women in the transport sector.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nguyen. Unfortunately, when we talk about gender issues and transport, we could take a whole night. But unfortunately, I don't have much time. So I'm going to ask the last question. There's many other questions, but just one question for all the panelists. And you only have 1 minute to answer this. Sorry, I'm pressed for time. But the question is this. If we were to imagine a city where women, girls, and different genders, right, LGBTQ++, where in public spaces for work, for education, for leisure, what mobility system would actually enable this? So it's like looking at an ideal mobility system where all genders would actually be included. All right, so who wants to start? Ms. Nett, you want to go ahead and answer this question?
For me, it is the high share of the women's in the transport sector. It is not only in the total employees, but also in the different management level, especially on the board. It is very important.
Thank you. So it's diversity, no? It's not just one level. Okay, thank you. Mr. Nguyen? The question is, what kind of system do you think would work well for all genders? I think that's the simplest way of putting the question.
Tôi nghĩ rằng là các cái giải pháp
I think that the solutions to increase female employees working in the transport sector, I think that besides the legal regulations of the government, I think that for transport businesses or transport employers, they need to conduct specific studies of each job positions and which job positions are suitable for women. So they need to prioritize the job positions that are suitable for women. And to increase opportunity for women, enterprises should have their own management regulation. For example, they should allocate suitable times for women and provide suitable environment, working environment for women to make sure that their working environment is safe, transparent, so that women feel secure to work in the working environment in the transport sector. And from the government, I would expect that the government would put in place policies to further promote the digital transformation in the economy in general, including the transport sector. And recently, we observed that when we applied digital transformation in the transport sector, it can address many issues. And without digital transformation, of course, we would encounter a number of challenges in which there is an issue of promoting e-commerce and promoting digital transformation in the business management, in linking businesses with the regulators and promoting digitalization in the interaction and connection between transport operators with the clients, with the passengers. So through different policy, if we promote, it will increase women employees in the transport sector.
All right, thank you. So there is a need for improved. Okay. Dr.Derlie, again, 1 minute. What kind of mobility systems do you think would best address the different travel patterns?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think Vienna, Austria has a very good example and model on how women-focused development development that would focus on the needs of women, and we're rationalizing that we respond to or cater for the needs of women, it will cater for a significant proportion of the population. And one of the key themes or principles that were used was the land use and transport integration. So there was it was really very walkable, and the destinations are near each other, because the point is women tend to go through different several destinations before they actually arrive at their final destination, right? So that's one model. And I think another, from a transport leadership, a transport sector representation, I think just recently, so last year, Women in Transport Strategy was approved, endorsed by Transport in Victoria. And it's to respond to the Gender Equity Act that has been, again, that requires reporting from all government public offices to report on their strategies to increase women representation within, particularly in male-dominated sectors such as transportation. And because of that, they provide suite of interventions like mentoring program, scholarships, etc., that addresses the leaky pipeline problem. Yeah, I won't explain any further. Thank you.
Sorry, 1 minute is too short for the answer. It's such a complex question. But I'd like to thank the panelists for this evening. We've had we've had interesting conversations, and we know we could go on and on about this, on how to empower women and create enabling environments for an equal society. I'd like to just highlight a few things that we've learned. And one of the things, of course, is how do you bring the social discourse, of shaping social discourse. And then one of the things you have to do is to make sure that you involve the stakeholders, because it's always nothing about us without us. You have to make sure that they're part of the conversation. You have to also include them, and to make sure that your conversation is context specific, right? I like what you said, that equality is actually talking about just human rights. When we talk about transport and mobility, it's actually human rights. And so there are many other things we can do to improve transport, make sure that land use and transport interact, our transport and land use are actually integrated, digitalization, improving women's participation through e-commerce, and many other initiatives. So thank you. There are many other questions, but I don't have much time. So I'd really like to thank our panelists, Ms. Net, Mr. Nguyen, and Dr. Derlie. I don't know what time it is in your areas, but I'm sure it's quite late already in Australia. Again, we would like to thank our participants, speakers, and the network behind this session, led by the Women on the Move Network, together with the Women in Transport Leadership, Women Mobilize Women, and the Women in Green Hydrogen, with the support, of course, from GIZ Vietnam. You may scan, the link can be found in the chat box to learn more about this network. Again, to everybody, we hope you enjoy the rest of the transport week, and see you in a few minutes with the closing of our Asian Hub conference. So thank you, everybody. Peace.